Hello, everyone. As we are all joining together virtually across the globe, it is probably a good idea to be reminded that we were once embodied beings meeting in a physical reality. So this is Mathis and me 2 years ago giving a presentation in Witten on the challenges and opportunities in dancing our own neurophenomenological dance. Our lecture today follows up on that and presents the maturation of our study on meditative-based self-boundary dissolution. Much of what we will present today is already available online in a preprint, which is currently under review. So after providing some background, we will focus on the results of the phenomenological investigation, where we systematically characterize the experiences of the 46 participating meditation practitioners in our study. We'll also show how we analyze the results to make them useful in guiding the neural analysis, and then show some early neural results. Finally, we'll discuss in more detail how our findings highlight an inactive view of the self. Our studies depart from classical ideas about the sense of self in psychology, differentiating two levels of the sense of self. We can be aware of the self as an object of experience, such as when we engage in self-referential thoughts about our past or future. However, more basic seems to be what has been termed the minimal self, an ongoing pre-reflective awareness of oneself as a bounded and embodied knower and agent. The incessant and implicit nature of the pre-reflective self makes operationalizing it for empirical research inherently difficult. In other words, it's quite challenging to manipulate this fundamental dimension of our selfhood. This is where our studies focused on deep meditative states become valuable. Experienced meditation practitioners can volitionally generate states of global dissolution of the sense of self. Their proficiency in experiential awareness also makes them a suitable cohort for a neurophenomenological study. So I'll assume that the basic idea of neurophenomenology is familiar to most of you, bringing together cognitive science and a disciplined examination of lived experience. Our research team at Aviva Berkovich-Ohana's lab in Israel published a guide to neurophenomenology, presenting a pragmatic take on this endeavor based on our own experience with neurophenomenological research. Very briefly, I'll just mention that we've presented in the paper a continuum of complexity of first-person data, ranging from thick, dynamic, and detailed to thin, which lacks dynamics and details, but is much easier to formalize and quantify. In this study, we did some of each of the continuum. We've also specified in the paper several ways to integrate the investigation of phenomenology and physiology. What we suggest is that one can engage into this circulation in various levels and in different ways, depending on the studied phenomena and its current level of understanding. Pragmatism and flexibility is key in neurophenomenology, and we'll attempt to show how this applies in our current study. So, to you, Mathis.
Okay, thank you, Ohad. And hello to everyone who's attending. So exemplifying these ideas that Ohad just presented about the neurophenomenological dialogue, a team brought together by Aviva Berkovich-Ohana conducted a series of neurophenomenological studies into the sense of self by collaborating with long-term meditators. So to show the point of departure of the current study, I will briefly highlight a few of the main findings. And specifically, I will focus on two studies that explored the sense of boundary, which forms the background of our current study. So in the first study, Yochai Ataria conducted interviews with Stephen Folder, who is an established meditation teacher and also the founder of the Israeli Insight Meditation Society. And in this qualitative study, he explored meditative experiences of alterations in the sense of self and characterized them under the concept of sense of boundary dissolution. And these alterations of the sense of self were, or the sense of boundaries were described in terms of 9 phenomenological dimensions. For example, the sense of internal versus external, the sense of location, or the sense of agency. And these were subsumed within the concept of the sense of boundaries, since all of them somehow involve the demarcation of boundaries between self and non-self. And in the neural complement to the study, Yair Dor-Zeideman conducted MEG assessments of different states of boundary dissolution, ranging from a default state to fully dissolved boundaries. And this study showed reductions in beta band oscillatory power, which were centered or which peaked on within the beta band at about 27 Hertz. And these reductions in beta power were localized to lateral parietal regions and medial parietal regions. So in the current study, we aimed to test whether these results were replicable and generalizable to a larger sample of meditators. And this involved testing the consistency or describing the consistency and diversity of the phenomenological reports, and also testing the replicability of effects on the neural level. And then we were also interested in the possibility of strengthening the sense of boundaries. So here meditators were asked to actively maintain the sense of boundaries while being in a meditative state. And finally, we were also interested in candidate mechanisms and aimed at developing a cognitive model of full-fledged minimal and embodied selfhood. And this, on the one hand, involves describing dynamics and relationships within the phenomenology, but also investigating corresponding candidate mechanisms on the neural level. And finally, we aimed at investigating trait correlates of the ability to flexibly manipulate the sense of boundaries. And here we targeted specifically abilities in the social domains, like, for example, empathy and perspective taking. For the presentation today, we are focusing on results regarding the consistency and the diversity of the phenomenology. We show results regarding the replication of neural effects, and also present some clues on the possibility to actively maintain the sense of boundaries. And finally, also present some results on the relationship and dynamics in the phenomenology. So concretely for this study, we recruited 46 meditators with a wide range of different amounts of meditation experience. They completed a 3 weeks meditation training to familiarize themselves with the sense of boundaries and the meditation-based dissolution. They completed a bunch of trait questionnaires, and they were invited for two sessions in the MEG lab, one focusing on state measurements and the second one focusing on trait assessments of social abilities. And this was really made possible by the hard work of Joaf Schweitzer, who is actually doing his PhD within this project and who's really the heart and the engine of the project. So to give you a sense of the methodology involved here, here's a video clip of one of the recordings. So the meditators are positioned in a lying posture, and different physiological measurements are taken. There's also an experiment with a tactile stimulation to the chest. They're located in an acoustically shielded chamber, and the magnetic fields that are emitted by the neural activity are recorded. Within this lab session, they complete 3 tasks. What we're focusing on here is the SB, the boundary alteration task, where they shifted through different states of boundary dissolution, boundary maintenance, and resting baselines. Then there were also 2 additional tasks on specific neural mechanisms that I won't go into here. And now back to Ohad.
So in terms of the phenomenological investigation, we've asked the participants 4 times during the entire session for a self-rating of each 1-minute epoch. A simple 1 to 3 rating of stability and depth, which makes for very thin first-person data, but this will provide specific epoch-wise information for the neural analysis. After the MEG meditation session was done, I've conducted phenomenological interviews with all participants, about 30 to 50 minutes each. The interviews were based on principles of the microphenomenology method. However, they are thematically guided in order to narrow the scope and also to relate to previous findings. In the process of analysis, we aim to phenomenologically characterize our participants' experiences systematically. In doing so, we delineated common phenomenological categories characterizing the experiential landscape of typical meditative states described by study participants. Then, based on these categories, 2 independent raters characterized the experience of each participant. Additionally, raters holistically evaluated on a 1 to 10 scale the degree of sense of boundary dissolution for each participant. Finally, a consensual evaluation of each participant was achieved through discussion. So now we'll present the results. First, the different types of experiences as organized in categories. This includes a taxonomy of the meditative techniques used by participants and the 6 experiential categories with which we specify the experience of each participants and also the degree of dissolution. Then Mathis will take over again and show you how he used this data in quantitative analysis and present some first unpublished neural results. So starting with meditative techniques, you see here a taxonomy for each condition of maintaining the sense of boundaries and dissolving it. This will all become clearer as I provide examples next. But what's important to emphasize here is that when maintaining the sense of boundaries, participants mostly use an active body scan meditation. And on the other hand, in attempting to dissolve their sense of boundaries, there was much more diversity. Participants used the imagination or memory. They sometimes turned their attention outwards. And most of them also released tension and effort and became more passive to varying degrees. So here are all experiential categories. Each of them has several subcategories for specific types of experiences. Each participant was characterized according to this scheme. So we have sense of agency, self-location, first-person perspective, attentional disposition, body sensations, and affective valence. So now I'll provide concrete examples from the many interviews we have, and start with the condition of maintaining sense of boundaries. So you can see below the graph of distribution within each category, which is very uniform as most experiences were similar. And here are 2 prototypical examples. So I begin with breathing and I base my focus there. And then I notice different parts of the body, the hands, the head. There was some pressure there. I attend all contact points of the body with the surface and blanket. So it's like the boundaries are at the periphery of my body. And then another practitioner said, like some kind of spirit that I'm traveling with inside the body. I feel only proximate space that is very, very close. So now moving on to experiences of sense of boundary dissolution, they are much more diverse. This is where the systematic characterization became meaningful in distinguishing different kinds of experiences. The holistic degree of dissolution, ranging from 1 to 9, shows that some participants had very mild experiences of dissolution, which means that their sense of self-boundaries changed only slightly, whereas other participants had very deep states of global dissolution of the structure of experience. So here we'll go category by category, providing examples of different kinds of experiences. So starting with self-location, which relates to where I am in relation to the perceived surrounding. So the first subcategory is the one of indeterminate self-world structure, a radical change in self-location. And the quote goes like this: "It's a puddle, and it's not solid anymore. There's no longer me. It stops being separate. It's not me melting on the bed. There's no me and there's no bed. It all melts together." And the second quote of the same subcategory, "It's like falling down there, opening, release. It's a space that's empty. There's nothing in it." Next up are different subcategories of expansion into vast space. So here's the example. It's as if I'm present in all of space altogether, like all of the space that my consciousness surrounds in this moment. It's like my presence is something much bigger than, say, just where my body is located. Rather, who I am is present in a very large space, large at least like, say, a building or something like that. And finally, another subcategory that has to do with the body and relatedness to the wider surrounding of the body. So the sense of body boundaries is beginning to diminish, and there's a sense of intimacy or belonging that's experienced somehow in relation to the room's boundaries. So that's a much less drastic change in experience. Now to the next category, sense of agency, that has to do with a sense of being in control over attention and mental actions. So here we go from active control to complete inaction. We start by action my action is to try and keep blowing up this balloon. It's like a struggle between this centering gravitational force and the attempt to really push the dividing line outwards as much as I can until it's gone. We'll skip the second one and go straight to the inactive passive one. She says, a deep breath, and then everything loses its grip. Until now, I was putting an artificial barrier over sensation. Now it's possible to let go of this barrier and let it extend. So going to the next category, attentional disposition, which reflects the way that participants were disposed towards objects of perception, and more concretely, how wide or narrow was the scope of attention and how dynamic or stable was it. So firstly, the wide and dynamic subcategory, one meditator said there's more attention on the sound of the room, of breathing. There's an experience of the body with no specific attention or specific sensations. It's a sort of roaming with whatever comes up. Then another subcategory that's wide and static. And it says, attention is much more open and wide. It doesn't include the sense of effort of being with something. All of a sudden, attention rests and things appear in it. But it doesn't stick. There's much less preference for anything. And finally, the subcategory of formless attention, which is more radical in change. And one meditator said, attention isn't there, it's gone. There's no experience at all. So I don't know what is there. I know that at some point attention gets back to some experience, but there's a stage in which there's no space, nothing. And another example is attention flows with everything. It's nowhere, but it's also not lost. A kind of very, very strong sensory experience of flowing and unraveling of all that was condensed. And the last example of the first-person perspective, category that marks the ongoing pre-reflective sense of being a subject that's distinct from the objects that are perceived. This is opposed to a non-dual state, as exemplified in this quote. There's a field of sensuality, and it's not bounded. I'm not located anywhere. I am not. It contributes to the dissolution. There's no sense of observer, no witness. It didn't lose the sense of being part of, not entirely. There's a sense of flow, and it is going through something. So these are rather rare experiences. These were only a few examples of hundreds, if not more. Hopefully they spark some interest in you for more details and clarification, but now Mathis will present the quantitative analysis of all this data with a neurophenomenological agenda in mind.
So while you hopefully got some sense and some feeling of what is going on in meditation-based boundary dissolution, based on the descriptions just provided by Ohad, our aim is to describe the variability and the structure of these reports also in a more formal way, in order to strengthen and complement this, the insight that Ohad derived on the qualitative level. So here the questions are, what are the relationships between the phenomenological categories? Are there different types of SB dissolution, of boundary dissolution, or is this rather a unitary phenomenon? And how can these data actually inform the neural analysis? So importantly, we are making a non-trivial assumption here that the categories have a dimensional character. So for example, for the agency category, it seems to make sense that agency reduces from an active sense of agency to a responsive and totally passive sense. And for the location dimension, it's already less obvious, but as well, as we will see, it seems that there is some kind of a continuum from being located within the body to expanding into the surrounding space, into the larger space, and finally breaking down all kinds of spatial discrimination. And similarly for attention, for example, there seems to be a continuum from focus, object-oriented attention towards a wider focus and finally formless mode of attention. So in order to describe possible relationships and get a sense of possible clusters, we plotted the data in a multidimensional space. So here you see, for example, here on this axis, agency increasing or actually dissolving from an active sense towards a passive sense of agency, and location expanding into a vast into space and into an indeterminate space. So what you might already take from this figure is that participants are mostly located alongside the diagonal which goes through the space, and they don't scatter so much into other places of the of this phenomenological space. On the other hand, for the state of for maintaining the boundaries, there is much more clustering, and most of the participants are actually located in this lower corner of the space. So the following analyses and results are mainly based on correlation analysis. So here we used Spearman correlations, which are not based on any assumptions of metric or linearly correlated or associated variables. And first we employed network analysis to actually get an overview of the relationships. So here we see that there's a high degree of interrelatedness of the different dimensions. So all of them except the valence category are actually pretty highly correlated, and also there tends to be a separation or some degree. So here on the left you have agency and attention being very closely together, and on the other hand you have location being closely associated with first-person perspective and body. And the tight correlation of all of these dimensions is also reflected in the fact that the first principal component actually explains 58% of the variance within the phenomenological space. So this allowed us to create an summary score summing together all of these dimensions to systematically capture SB dissolution. Moreover, if we look, or we also were interested to test the effect of different techniques, as well as the effect of previous meditation practice. And here we find that actually gestures of relaxation and release, as well as movements of turning attention outwards, had the strongest effect on boundary dissolution. And also the amount of previous lifetime meditation hours were strongly correlated with the degree of dissolution. And this was actually driven by correlations with the agency, the first-person perspective, and the attention dimension. So in terms of the neural results, the first question actually targeted the replication of the effects. And here we had two hypotheses. On the one hand, referring to the comparison of the state of dissolved boundaries, here referred to as SB minus, compared to a resting baseline. And the second hypothesis targeting or referring to the state of SB minus compared to maintaining the boundaries. And for both of these contrasts, we predicted a reduction of oscillatory power in the beta range. And to actually increase the chances of really replicating the results, we focused on a subsample of what we call full dissolvers, which were defined by criteria on the agency, location, and first-person perspective dimensions. And so this participants here had to have the highest rating on at least one of these dimensions and the second highest rating on the other dimensions. So you can see that this involves the participants in the higher quadrant of the phenomenological space. And all of these hypotheses and analysis were actually pre-registered, and we also blinded ourselves to the respective meditation conditions during the analysis. So for the first contrast, comparing SB minus or dissolved boundaries to rest, we actually find a broad reduction of oscillatory power across a broad range of frequencies. And the peak of these reductions is actually centered on the peak frequency from the previous studies, and also involves most of the range of the frequency of interest defined based on this previous study. And also the topography is very consistent with the previous findings. Furthermore, there were additional significant clusters of reduced powers in other frequency bands. And for the second contrast, comparing dissolved boundaries to maintaining boundaries, we find a very similar pattern. However, as you might see already, the effects here are somewhat weaker, and this is actually explained by the fact that the beta power, but also power in other bands, actually decreased from rest to SB plus, to the maintaining boundaries condition, and to dissolving boundaries. So this might be somewhat unexpected and is somehow contrasts with the specificity of these effects, but does somewhat correspond to the phenomenology where we also observed at least some alteration and sometimes also some degree of dissolution in the SB plus condition. However, we also investigate or aim to investigate the correspondence with the phenomenology in more detail. And here we compared a group of the group of full dissolvers just presented with the remaining sample. And as you can see here, descriptively, the effects seem to be stronger in the full dissolvers. However, when contrasting this on a statistical level, these differences are not significant. And another way to actually test that would be to extract the values from the cluster. And again, you can see that the full dissolvers have, for both contrasts, they have stronger reductions, but again, these effects are not significant. Okay, to conclude and sum up the neural results, we observed a widespread reduction of oscillatory power in boundary alteration, and this effect was most pronounced in boundary dissolution. Furthermore, we replicated the effects previously found of beta reduction in association with SB dissolution. However, the specificity of these effects remains unclear, since there was also significant reduction in the boundary maintenance condition, and there was a significant degree of reduction in participants showing limited degrees of dissolution. So this is still work in progress. We are still testing additional neural markers. For example, we also have pre-registered hypotheses on changes in the source space, and we also aim to explore connectivity.
So we're still crossing fingers for more meaningful results that validate the use of this kind of phenomenological investigation and analysis in the context of a neurophenomenological dialogue. However, there's also much more to discuss about the sense of self philosophically and phenomenologically that is part of this dialogue, an important part of this dialogue. So we'll end this presentation with some notes about how our findings highlight an inactive approach to the self. So cognition, according to the inactive approach, has to do with skillful know-how in situated and embodied action. Such interactive nature is said to give rise to the co-emergence of inside and outside, of selfhood and otherness. In other words, the pre-reflective sense of self is not separate from the process of perceiving and acting, rather than an exclusively mental and internal affair like passive representation. The sense of self is said to implicitly arise during attention-demanding interactions with the environment in which it is embedded and inherently related. So our findings are aligned with this view, specifically with the interrelatedness that we found between the different phenomenological features of the self. We've expected some modularity and specific variations, but we found that for the most part, they appear to codependently arise and codependently dissolve. We've also found that deep dissolution of self-boundaries was mostly accompanied with a more global dissolution of the structure of the perceived world, of the structure of experience altogether, again highlighting this idea of co-emergence. We suggest an understanding of the boundaries of the self as flexible and dependent on the mode of interaction with its surrounding. This is also influenced by affectivity, and our paper discusses that a bit more in length. So in what way is the sense of boundaries flexible? Our findings highlight a clear difference between the two conditions of maintaining the sense of boundaries and dissolving it. The sense of active engagement with the surrounding, already reduced during meditative practice, was still evident in the condition of maintaining the sense of boundaries, mainly through the dynamic movement of focused attention, scanning body sensations. It resulted in a constriction of the sense of space to the area of the body within bodily boundaries, and accordingly a contracted sense of self, localized in the head or identified with a moving location of attention. Conversely, deep states of boundary dissolution were often characterized as surrendering into an effortless sense of passivity, characterized by an attenuation of all mental activity, and more subtly in the suspension of attentional dynamics. We suggest interpreting such results in light of the inactive approach, which predicts that such unusual reduction in the incessant activity of perception, action, and attention will undercut the contribution of these sense-making mechanisms from which self and world co-emerge. Potentially, this also relates to the global reduction in neural activity that Mathis presented earlier. So that's all, folks. Here's all our collaborators and supporting institutions. Now back to a shared Zoom presence.